The house sat at the end of a long, winding road, surrounded by thick woods. It had been in Claire's family for generations, a secluded place with creaky floors and drafty windows. She hadn't visited in years, but when her parents asked her to check on it while they were away, she reluctantly agreed. It was late afternoon when Claire arrived, the setting sun casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. She parked her car and made her way to the front door, keys jingling in her hand. The door groaned as it opened, revealing a dimly lit hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. Claire flicked on the light switch, but the bulb flickered and then went out, plunging the hallway back into darkness. She cursed under her breath and decided to check the fuse box in the basement. The basement was even darker, the air thick and musty. The old wooden stairs creaked under her weight as she descended, each step echoing through the empty house. She found the fuse box in the far corner and flipped a few switches. The lights upstairs flickered back on, casting a dim glow through the basement door. As she turned to leave, something caught her eye. A small, dusty box tucked away in the corner, partially hidden behind some old furniture. Curious, she pulled it out and opened it. Inside were old photographs, yellowed with age, of people she didn't recognize. They were all taken in the same room, the basement. In each photo, the people were standing in front of the same spot, but something was off. Their expressions were blank, their eyes dark and hollow. Claire felt a chill run down her spine as she flipped through the pictures. In the last photo, there was a figure standing in the background, barely visible in the shadows. It was a man, tall and thin, with a face that was just a blur of darkness. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a soft shuffling, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. Claire froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She listened, but the sound stopped as quickly as it had started. She shook her head, telling herself it was just the wind, or maybe a raccoon that had gotten inside. She hurried back upstairs, slamming the basement door behind her. The house felt different now, heavier, as if the walls were closing in on her. She locked the front door and checked all the windows, making sure they were secure. The sun had set completely by now, and the house was bathed in darkness, the only light coming from the dim lamps she had managed to turn on. Claire decided to stay in the living room, where she could keep an eye on the front door. She curled up on the couch with a blanket, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over her. She told herself it was just an old house, creaky and full of strange noises. There was nothing to be afraid of. Hours passed, and the house remained silent. Claire's eyelids grew heavy, and she found herself drifting off to sleep. But just as she was about to doze off, she heard it again. A soft shuffling sound coming from the hallway. Her eyes snapped open, and she sat up, listening intently. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the living room door. Claire's heart was in her throat as she stared at the door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The house was silent once more. She slowly got up, clutching the blanket around her shoulders, and crept toward the door. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. She hesitated for a moment, then yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. She let out a shaky breath, her heart still racing. She was about to close the door when she noticed something on the floor. Footprints, muddy and wet, leading down the hallway and stopping right in front of the basement door. Claire's blood ran cold as she stared at the footprints. They weren't hers. She hadn't been outside since she came in, and the mud was still fresh. Without thinking, she grabbed her car keys and bolted for the front door. She didn't look back as she ran to her car, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get the key into the ignition. She sped down the driveway, not stopping until she was miles away from the house. She never went back. Weeks later, when her parents returned, they found the house just as she had left it, except for one thing. The basement door was open, and the dusty box she had found was gone. It was a late November evening, and Jenna found herself home alone for the weekend. Her parents had gone on a brief trip to visit some relatives, leaving her in charge of the house. Jenna was used to spending time alone, but the old Victorian house she lived in always had a way of making her feel uneasy, especially at night. The house was large, with creaky wooden floors and dimly lit hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. The wind howled outside, rattling the old windows, and the branches of the oak tree in the front yard scraped against the glass, like bony fingers trying to claw their way inside. Jenna had settled into the living room with a blanket and a book, trying to distract herself from the eerie noises that seemed to echo throughout the house. As the hours ticked by, she started to feel a bit more comfortable, convinced that it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. Around midnight, she decided it was time to head upstairs to bed. She turned off the lights in the living room, and the house was immediately plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the moonlight seeping through the curtains. As Jenna ascended the creaky staircase, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She paused halfway up and glanced over her shoulder, but the hallway behind her was empty. She took a deep breath and continued up to her room, chalking up her nerves to being alone in the house. Jenna got ready for bed, brushing her teeth and slipping into her pajamas. She pulled the covers up to her chin and tried to relax, but the uneasy feeling from earlier persisted. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was just paranoia, and eventually drifted off to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, Jenna awoke to the sound of soft footsteps echoing in the hallway outside her bedroom. At first, she thought it might be her parents returning early, but she quickly remembered they wouldn't be back until the next day. Her heart pounded in her chest as she lay still, listening intently. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving closer and closer to her door. She pulled the covers over her head, hoping that whatever it was would just go away. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped right outside her bedroom door. The silence that followed was deafening. Jenna held her breath, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Then, she heard the doorknob slowly turn. Jenna's heart raced as the door creaked open ever so slightly. She could feel a cold draft wafting into the room, chilling her to the bone. She peeked out from under the covers and saw a dark figure standing in the doorway. It was tall and shadowy, with no discernible features, but its presence was overwhelming and terrifying. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, as if it were waiting for something. Jenna's mind raced as she tried to figure out what to do. She wanted to scream, but her voice was caught in her throat. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly turned and walked back down the hallway, the sound of its footsteps fading into the distance. Jenna remained frozen in her bed, too terrified to move. When the morning light finally streamed through the window, Jenna found the courage to get out of bed and check the house. She cautiously opened her bedroom door and looked down the hallway, but there was no sign of the figure from the night before. The house was as still and quiet as ever. Jenna never told anyone about what she saw that night, but she never felt truly alone in that house again. Every creak, every shadow seemed to hold a sinister presence, as if the house itself was alive and watching her. And every night, as she climbed the stairs to bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself once more. When Emily's parents decided to go on a weekend getaway, she was thrilled to have the house to herself. It was an old Victorian home, creaky but charming, and nestled on the outskirts of town. Emily had always loved the place, especially the way it felt so full of history, with its ornate woodwork, antique furniture, and the stories her parents told about its past. The only thing she wasn't fond of was how isolated it could feel at night, but with a few movies lined up and some snacks, she was ready for a relaxing evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the house was bathed in shadows, Emily settled into the living room with her favorite blanket, ready to start her movie marathon. Just as she hit play, the lights flickered. She paused, glancing around. The house was old, and power fluctuations weren't unusual, so she shrugged it off and continued watching. The lights flickered again, more insistently this time, and she heard a faint, almost imperceptible thumping sound. Emily tensed, listening carefully, but the noise didn't repeat. She tried to shake off the unease creeping over her and focused on the screen. But the third time the lights flickered, they went out completely. Emily's heart raced as she fumbled for her phone, turning on the flashlight feature. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, but it only seemed to make the shadows loom larger. She took a deep breath, convincing herself it was just a blown fuse, and headed for the basement to check the breaker box. The stairs creaked ominously as she descended into the basement, the air growing colder with each step. When she reached the bottom, the flashlight beam caught the edge of something that made her blood run cold. On the floor, half buried in dust, was a doll. It hadn't been there before. She was sure of it. The doll was old, its face cracked and one eye missing. Emily's parents didn't keep any toys in the house. Where had this come from? She heard a soft giggle, so faint she almost thought she imagined it. Her heart pounded as she spun around, the flashlight beam shaking as it cut through the darkness. The basement was empty, but the oppressive silence felt like it was pressing in on her. Determined to finish what she came for, she forced herself to move to the breaker box. As she opened it, she noticed something that made her stomach drop. The main breaker was off, flipped by someone or something. Emily's hand trembled as she flipped it back, and the lights in the basement flickered back on. But the relief was short-lived. In the corner of the room, she saw it. A shadow, distinctly shaped like a person, standing perfectly still. Emily froze, her breath caught in her throat. The shadow didn't move, but she could feel its presence, heavy and malevolent. Gathering her courage, she shone the flashlight directly at it. There was nothing there, no person, no object to cast the shadow. Just an empty corner. A chill ran down her spine as the giggle echoed again, louder this time and unmistakably close. Emily backed up, her heart hammering in her chest. She bolted up the stairs, leaving the doll, the shadow, and whatever was lurking in the basement behind her. Once upstairs, she locked the basement door and leaned against it, trying to catch her breath. She decided to call her parents, but the call wouldn't go through. The screen on her phone started glitching, random lines and static covering the display. And then, as if to mock her, the lights flickered again. Terrified, Emily decided she couldn't stay in the house. She grabbed her keys and headed for the front door. But as she reached for the knob, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. From the basement came the unmistakable creak of footsteps on the stairs, slow and deliberate. Without thinking, Emily yanked the door open and ran to her car. She didn't stop driving until she was at a friend's house on the other side of town. It was only the next morning, after she had calmed down, that she called her parents to explain what happened. When they returned, her father checked the house thoroughly. He found the doll, but there was no sign of an intruder or any explanation for the shadow. The house seemed perfectly normal, as if nothing had happened at all. But Emily knew better. She never stayed home alone again after that night, and eventually her family moved out of the house. Whoever or whatever was in that basement, she never wanted to find out. It was a chilly autumn evening when 17-year-old Jessica found herself home alone. Her parents had gone to a weekend retreat, leaving her to enjoy the solitude of their secluded countryside house. She relished the idea of having the place to herself, a rare break from the chaos of her school and social life. The house, surrounded by dense woods, had always been her sanctuary, quiet, peaceful, and familiar. But that night, it felt different. Jessica settled into the living room with a movie and a blanket, the soft glow of the TV casting flickering shadows on the walls. As the hours passed, the wind outside began to pick up, howling through the trees and rattling the windows. She wrapped the blanket tighter around herself, telling herself it was just the weather making her uneasy. Halfway through the movie, she heard it, a faint whisper. Jessica paused the movie, straining her ears. Silence. She shook her head, laughing at her jumpiness, and resumed the film. But then she heard it again, clearer this time. It sounded like a voice, coming from the walls. Her heart pounded as she muted the TV and listened closely. The whisper was barely audible, but it was there, like someone speaking just on the other side of the wall. Jessica! Her blood ran cold. The voice knew her name. She stood up slowly, her eyes darting around the room. The voice seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. seeping through the very walls of the house. "Jessica, help me." She backed away, her mind racing. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe she was just imagining things. But the voice was so real, so insistent. She grabbed her phone and called her parents, but the call wouldn't go through. The screen flashed no service. Desperate for an explanation, she decided to investigate. With trembling hands, she picked up a flashlight and made her way through the house, checking every room. The voice continued, growing more frantic as she moved from room to room. "Jessica, please help." It was coming from the basement. She had always hated the basement. The air down there was damp and heavy, and it had a strange, musty smell. But she had no choice. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door and descended the creaky wooden steps. The basement was pitch dark except for the beam of her flashlight, which cut through the thick blackness like a knife. She could hear her own breathing, fast and shallow, as she reached the bottom. The voice was louder now, pleading, desperate. "Help me, I'm trapped." The sound was coming from behind an old, dusty bookshelf. Jessica hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch it. She felt a strange compulsion, as if the voice was drawing her closer, urging her to find its source. With a deep breath, she pushed the bookshelf aside, revealing a hidden door. It was small, barely noticeable, and covered in cobwebs. Her heart raced as she reached for the rusty doorknob and slowly turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, dark passageway. The voice was louder now, echoing through the narrow space. Jessica shone her flashlight into the passage and saw a figure. A shadowy, indistinct shape hunched in the darkness. "Help me, please." The figure slowly lifted its head, and Jessica saw its face, or what was left of it. It was a grotesque, rotting visage, with hollow eye sockets and decayed skin hanging from its bones. The thing was barely human, a twisted, tormented soul trapped in the walls of her home. Jessica screamed and stumbled backward, but it was too late. The figure lunged at her, its bony hands reaching out, and she felt an icy grip on her arm. She tried to pull away, but the thing was too strong. It pulled her into the passage, and the door slammed shut behind her. Her scream echoed through the empty house, but there was no one there to hear it. When her parents returned the next morning, they found the house silent and empty. Jessica was gone, vanished without a trace. The only sign that anything had happened was the bookshelf, slightly askew, and the faint whispering that seemed to linger in the walls, growing louder each night. "Jessica, help me." No one ever figured out what had happened to her. But if you listen closely, late at night when the house is quiet, you might just hear it. The whispering walls calling out for help, trapped in the darkness forever. Alyssa always looked forward to weekends when her parents went out of town. The quietness of the house was a rare treat, a break from the usual chaos of her younger siblings. This weekend, she had the entire place to herself, and she planned to binge-watch her favorite horror movies late into the night. It was around 11 p.m. when she finally settled onto the couch with a blanket and a bowl of popcorn. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of old wood and the soft hum of the refrigerator. The first movie played, filling the living room with flickering light and unsettling noises. As the movie reached a particularly tense scene, Alyssa heard a sound that didn't come from the TV. It was faint, almost like a whisper, coming from upstairs. She paused the movie, straining to hear. After a few moments of silence, she convinced herself it was just the house settling and resumed watching. But the sound came again. This time it was unmistakable. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on a surface. Her heart began to race as she muted the TV, listening intently. The tapping continued, now louder and more deliberate, coming from her bedroom upstairs. Alyssa tried to rationalize the noise. Maybe it was the wind knocking something against the window, or perhaps an animal had somehow gotten inside. She grabbed her phone, turning on the flashlight, and slowly made her way upstairs, her footsteps barely making a sound on the carpeted steps. When she reached the top of the stairs, the tapping stopped. The sudden silence was unnerving. She cautiously approached her bedroom, her hand trembling as she reached for the door handle. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The room was just as she had left it. The bed was neatly made, and nothing seemed out of place. She scanned the room with her flashlight, her heart pounding in her chest. But there was nothing, no sign of anything that could have made the noise. Alyssa exhaled, feeling a bit foolish. Maybe it was just her imagination playing tricks on her after all the horror movies. She turned to leave, but just as she did, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. On her nightstand, where she usually kept a glass of water, there was a single wet handprint. It was too large to be hers. She backed away slowly, her mind racing with possibilities. Her phone buzzed in her hand, startling her. It was a text message from her mom, checking in to see how she was doing. Alyssa quickly replied that everything was fine, trying to keep her growing fear in check. Suddenly, the tapping resumed, louder and more insistent, but this time it was coming from the closet. Alyssa's breath hitched as she stared at the closet door, which was slightly ajar. The tapping was now accompanied by a faint, raspy breathing. Fighting the urge to run, Alyssa took a step toward the closet, her hand shaking as she reached for the handle. She yanked the door open, her flashlight illuminating the small, cramped space. But it was empty, just her clothes hanging neatly on the rack and a few boxes on the floor. But then, she noticed something even more disturbing. The clothes hanging at the back of the closet were moving, as if someone had just brushed past them. A cold draft hit her, carrying with it a smell she couldn't quite place. Damp, earthy, and distinctly unpleasant. Without thinking, Alyssa slammed the closet door shut and bolted downstairs. She grabbed her keys and fled the house, not stopping until she was in her car with the doors locked. She sat there, panting, trying to make sense of what had just happened. That night, Alyssa stayed at a friend's house, too terrified to go back home. The next morning, she returned with her parents, who assured her it was just her imagination. But Alyssa knew what she had seen, what she had heard. They searched the house from top to bottom but found nothing out of the ordinary. But when they reached her bedroom, her father noticed something chilling. The wet handprint was still on the nightstand, now dried and faint, but clearly visible. And in the closet, behind the boxes, they found a small, hidden door leading to a narrow crawl space. The space was empty, except for a single, muddy footprint leading from the door to where Alyssa's clothes had been disturbed. Her parents tried to dismiss it, but Alyssa knew better. Someone or something had been in the house with her that night, watching her, moving through the walls. She never stayed home alone again. Lena had always loved the peace of her small, isolated home. Nestled at the edge of the woods, it was a cozy retreat from the chaos of city life. She had moved there to escape the noise, to find solitude in the quiet rustle of trees and the distant calls of owls. The house was old, creaky, but it had a charm she couldn't resist. One chilly autumn evening, Lena found herself home alone. Her husband, Mark, was away on a business trip, and she was looking forward to a night of reading by the fire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the living room, Lena settled into her favorite armchair with a cup of tea and a thick novel. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Hours passed, and Lena became engrossed in her book. The story was gripping, filled with suspense and eerie twists. But as the night grew darker, she began to feel a growing unease. It wasn't unusual for the house to make noises. Old homes like this always did. But tonight, the creaks felt different. They were more deliberate, like the sound of footsteps on the floorboards. Lena tried to ignore it, chalking it up to her imagination. But when she heard a distinct thud coming from upstairs, her heart skipped a beat. She was certain she was alone in the house. She had locked all the doors, closed all the windows. No one could have gotten in, right? Setting her book aside, Lena stood up and listened carefully. Silence. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the growing fear in her chest. "It's just the house settling," she whispered to herself. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. She decided to check upstairs, just to be sure. She grabbed the small flashlight from the side table and headed toward the staircase. As she ascended, the air grew colder, and the wooden stairs groaned under her weight. At the top of the stairs, she paused, listening for any sound. The hallway stretched out before her, dark and still. The doors to the 3 bedrooms were all slightly ajar, just as she had left them. She stepped forward, shining the flashlight into each room. The first room, her office, was exactly as she had left it. Papers scattered on the desk, her laptop closed. The second room, a guest bedroom they rarely used, was undisturbed, the bed neatly made. But as she reached the third room, the master bedroom, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The bed covers were pulled back, as if someone had just gotten out of bed. Lena froze, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't been in the bedroom since morning, and she distinctly remembered making the bed. Slowly, she approached the bed, her hands trembling. She scanned the room with her flashlight, but nothing seemed out of place. Yet, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Suddenly, there was a soft creak behind her. Lena spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. The hallway was empty, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Panic began to set in, and she backed away from the bed, her mind racing. Should she call the police? What would she even tell them? As she fumbled for her phone, she heard another sound. A faint whisper, so quiet she almost missed it. It was coming from the closet. Lena's blood turned to ice. She pointed the flashlight toward the closet door, which was slightly ajar. The whispering continued, just barely audible, like someone murmuring in their sleep. Gathering every ounce of courage, Lena took a step toward the closet. Her hand shook as she reached for the doorknob. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. With a deep breath, she yanked the door open, the flashlight beam piercing the darkness inside. The closet was empty. Lena let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding her. But the relief was short-lived. As she turned to leave the room, she caught a glimpse of something in the mirror on the wall, a dark figure standing directly behind her. She whipped around, but the room was empty. The whispering returned, now coming from all around her, echoing through the room. Lena's vision blurred with fear as she stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the rug and falling to the floor. The flashlight slipped from her grasp, rolling away and plunging the room into darkness. The last thing Lena heard before everything went black was a voice, cold and clear, whispering in her ear, "You're not alone." When Mark returned the next morning, he found Lena in the master bedroom, unconscious but unharmed. The doctors said it was shock, but they couldn't explain the deep, hand-shaped bruises on her arms. Lena never stayed in that house alone again, but sometimes, late at night, she could still hear the whispering, soft, persistent, and terrifyingly real. Sarah had always loved her cozy little house nestled at the edge of town. It was quiet, away from the hustle and bustle, the perfect place to relax after long days at work. Tonight was one of those nights where she had the house entirely to herself. Her husband, Tom, was away on a business trip, and the kids were staying at their grandparents'. She relished the idea of having the evening to herself, curled up with a good book and a glass of wine. The wind outside howled, rustling the branches of the old oak tree that stood in their yard. It was the kind of night where the darkness seemed thicker, almost tangible. The house creaked and groaned as it settled, but these were sounds Sarah was used to. She knew every nook and cranny of the place. It was home after all. Sarah had just settled into the oversized armchair in the living room when she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible knock on the front door. Her heart skipped a beat. Who could it be at this hour? She glanced at the clock. 11:45 p.m. The neighborhood was quiet, and visitors at this time were rare. She stood up, cautiously walking to the door. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing but the darkness of the night. No one was there. She took a deep breath, shook her head, and told herself it was probably just her imagination playing tricks on her. After all, it was late and she was tired. She returned to her chair, trying to immerse herself in the book once more. But the uneasy feeling lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. Moments later, the knock came again, louder this time. Sarah froze, the hair on the back of her neck standing on end. She put the book down and walked to the door again, a sense of dread creeping into her chest. This time, she didn't look through the peephole. Instead, she called out, "Who's there?" Her voice trembled slightly. Silence. Sarah waited, straining to hear anything. Footsteps, breathing, anything. But all she could hear was the wind outside and the distant hum of a car passing by on the main road. After a few moments, she reluctantly turned away from the door. As she walked back to the living room, she felt something. A coldness, a draft, like someone had left a window open. But she had checked all the windows before she settled in for the night. She knew they were all closed. The feeling of being watched washed over her. She turned around, quickly scanning the room. It was empty, just as it had been moments ago. But the sensation didn't go away. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she walked to the kitchen, her eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. Then, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The back door, which she was certain she had locked, was slightly ajar. She rushed to it, slamming it shut and bolting it. But the unease was growing, gnawing at her insides. Sarah tried to calm herself, taking deep breaths, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, terribly wrong. She decided to check the rest of the house, just to be sure. Slowly, she moved from room to room, turning on every light as she went. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the air felt heavy, oppressive. She was about to head back downstairs when she heard a faint creak from above. The attic, a place she hardly ever went, full of old boxes and forgotten memories. Her pulse quickened, and she debated whether she should investigate or just ignore it. But the sound came again, this time a bit louder, like something or someone was moving up there. Summoning her courage, Sarah grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and headed towards the attic. The stairs creaked under her weight, each step feeling like an eternity. The door to the attic was old, with rusted hinges that groaned as she pushed it open. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing dusty old boxes and cobwebs. But nothing else. She was about to turn around and leave when she noticed something odd in the far corner. A box she didn't recognize, one that she hadn't seen before. It was small, covered in a layer of dust, but it looked newer than everything else around it. Her curiosity piqued. Sarah walked over to it, her hands trembling slightly as she knelt down to open it. Inside, she found an old, weathered photo album, the kind with thick, yellowed pages. She flipped it open, and her breath caught in her throat. The first photo was of her house, but not as she knew it. It looked older, more worn, and standing in front of it was a family, none of whom she recognized. She turned the pages slowly, each photo more unsettling than the last. The same house, the same family, but with each page, the family members looked more distorted. Their faces blurred, their eyes darkened, as if something was consuming them. Sarah's hands shook as she reached the last page. There, glued to the page, was a recent photo of her house. And in the window, staring out, was a figure, tall, shadowy, with hollow eyes. It was standing in the very living room she had just left. The flashlight flickered, and the attic door creaked shut behind her. Sarah whipped around, her heart pounding in her ears. But the door was still open, just as she had left it. She slammed the album shut and bolted down the stairs, her mind racing. She needed to get out of the house now. But as she reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw something that stopped her dead in her tracks. The front door was wide open, and standing just outside, illuminated by the dim porch light, was the figure from the photo. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching her with those hollow eyes. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her. She wasn't alone in the house. She never had been. The figure took a step forward, crossing the threshold. Sarah backed away, her mind screaming for her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. The air around her grew colder, heavier, as the figure slowly advanced. And then, everything went dark. The next morning, the police found the front door of Sarah's house wide open, the lights still on, but there was no sign of her. The only thing out of place was an old photo album, lying open on the living room floor, its pages blank, except for one last photo. Sarah, standing at the window, her eyes hollow and empty, staring out into the darkness. To this day, no one knows what happened to Sarah, but the house remains empty, abandoned. Some say that on dark, windy nights, you can still hear faint knocking coming from inside, and if you're brave enough to look through the windows, you might just see a shadowy figure staring back at you. It was a cold, rainy night when Sarah found herself home alone. The rain pattered against the windows like a relentless, rhythmic drumming, making the house feel even more isolated. Her parents had gone out for the evening, leaving her with strict instructions to lock the doors and not let anyone in. Sarah, being 17 and somewhat used to being alone, wasn't bothered. She had plans to curl up with a good book and some hot cocoa. As she settled onto the couch with her book, she heard the faint creak of a floorboard upstairs. Sarah paused, listening. The old house was known to make strange noises, especially when it rained. She dismissed it as the house settling and returned to her book. But then, the creak came again, this time accompanied by a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. Sarah's heart began to race. She put the book down and strained to listen. The whisper was there, faint and distant, but unmistakable. It seemed to be coming from the hallway upstairs. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, slowly making her way to the staircase. As she reached the bottom step, she could feel the air around her grow colder, and the whispering grew louder, though she still couldn't make out any words. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, just the eerie whispering that seemed to echo through the walls. She shone the flashlight up the stairs, illuminating the dark hallway. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive. Gathering her courage, Sarah slowly ascended the stairs, her hand gripping the railing tightly. When she reached the top, the whispering abruptly stopped, plunging the house into an almost deafening silence. She stood there, frozen, her breath caught in her throat. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw a shadow move across the hallway, slipping into her parents' bedroom. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she cautiously approached the door. It was slightly ajar, just enough to see a sliver of darkness inside. She pushed it open with trembling hands, the door creaking ominously on its hinges. The room was empty, but the air was thick with an unnatural chill. The whispering started again, louder this time, and distinctly coming from the corner of the room. Sarah's flashlight beam landed on the corner, revealing nothing but an old rocking chair that had belonged to her grandmother. It rocked gently back and forth, as if someone had just been sitting in it. Terrified, Sarah stepped back, but the door slammed shut behind her with a force that shook the walls. The whispering grew frantic, overlapping voices that seemed to surround her. She pressed herself against the door, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Then, amidst the whispers, she heard her name being called softly, but with an unmistakable tone of malice. "Sarah, Sarah." The voice was coming from the chair. Her blood ran cold as she watched a shadowy figure begin to materialize in the chair, slowly taking on a human form. Sarah's mind raced, and she did the only thing she could think of. She closed her eyes and screamed. The whispers crescendoed into a cacophony of voices, filling the room with a deafening roar. The temperature dropped even further, and she felt an icy hand brush against her arm. Just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The room was silent again. Sarah slowly opened her eyes, expecting to see the shadowy figure still sitting in the chair. But it was gone. The chair was still, the room was warm again, and the door behind her opened easily. Shaking, Sarah bolted out of the room, down the stairs, and out the front door. She didn't stop running until she was halfway down the street. She called her parents, who rushed home to find her sitting on the neighbor's porch, pale and trembling. They searched the house but found nothing unusual, no signs of an intruder, no explanation for what Sarah had experienced. But she knew what she had felt, what she had heard. The whispering shadows in her home were real, and they weren't going to let her forget that night. From that night on, Sarah refused to stay home alone. The house, once a place of comfort, had become a place of dread, haunted by something she could never fully explain. And though the whispers never returned, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was always watching, waiting for the next time she would be alone. Sarah lived alone in her old family house, a Victorian structure that had seen better days. After her parents passed away, she inherited the home, and despite its age and creaky floors, she cherished the place. However, the house had always held an eerie charm that Sarah could never quite shake off. One chilly October evening, Sarah decided to stay in for the night. She had recently installed a new home security system and was confident in its abilities to keep her safe. As she settled in with a book and a cup of tea, she couldn't help but notice how quiet the house was. The usual creaks and groans of the aging structure seemed more pronounced in the silence. Around midnight, Sarah's phone buzzed with a notification from her security system. She frowned and checked the app, which showed a live feed from the hallway camera on the second floor. The hallway was empty, but the system had detected movement. She shrugged it off, assuming it was a glitch, and went back to her book. The notification buzzed again, and this time the camera feed showed something odd. There, at the end of the hallway, a shadowy figure seemed to be standing still. Sarah's heart raced as she squinted at the screen, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The figure was small, and its shape resembled a child. It didn't move, just stood there as if waiting. Fighting her growing anxiety, Sarah decided to investigate. She climbed the stairs slowly, her footsteps echoing in the silence. As she reached the second floor, the shadowy figure vanished from the camera feed. She walked down the hallway, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The floorboards creaked under her weight, but the hallway was empty. She checked every room, but nothing seemed out of place. Just as she was about to head back downstairs, she noticed a small, dusty door at the end of the hallway that she had never seen before. The door was slightly ajar, revealing darkness beyond. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she pushed the door open. The room inside was small and filled with old furniture covered in white sheets. A cold draft brushed against her as she entered, and her flashlight flickered. On the floor, she spotted a dusty old toy, a broken doll with one eye missing. Its once cheery face now looked unsettling in the dim light. Sarah's breath caught in her throat when she noticed something else. A child's drawing on the wall. It was crude but depicted a small figure with a wide, sad face and what looked like tears. At the bottom of the drawing, in uneven handwriting, was a message, "Please don't leave me." Feeling a chill run down her spine, Sarah quickly retreated from the room and closed the door. She went back downstairs, her mind racing with thoughts. The security feed remained still and silent for the rest of the night, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching her. The next morning, Sarah did some research and discovered that the house had once belonged to a family who had a young child. The child had disappeared under mysterious circumstances many years ago, and the case had remained unsolved. To this day, Sarah can't explain the shadowy figure or the drawing she found. She eventually moved out of the house, unable to ignore the feeling that someone, or something, was still waiting in those dusty rooms, hoping to be found. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, Emma was looking forward to a rare evening alone in her family home. Her parents were out of town for the weekend, and her older brother was staying at a friend's house. With the house to herself, she planned to enjoy some peace and quiet. On the evening of the first night alone, Emma decided to watch a movie. As she settled on the couch with a blanket and popcorn, she noticed a strange cold draft. It was odd because the windows were closed and the heating was on. Dismissing it as a minor quirk of the old house, she focused on the film. Around midnight, she went upstairs to get ready for bed. As she passed the hallway mirror, she glanced at her reflection and saw something unsettling. For a split second, the reflection in the mirror didn't match her movements. It seemed to lag slightly, almost as if it was reacting with a delay. Emma blinked and shook off the odd sensation. In bed, the house was eerily quiet. The draft she felt earlier was now more pronounced, making the room feel unnervingly cold. She tried to ignore it and drifted off to sleep. A few hours later, she was jolted awake by a loud bang downstairs. Her heart raced, and she listened intently, but the house was silent once more. She convinced herself it was just the house settling. The next morning, Emma went to the kitchen to make breakfast. As she walked past the mirror in the hallway, she noticed something chilling: a handprint on the glass. It was smudged and seemed fresh. She was certain she had not touched the mirror, and the handprint was much too large to be hers. She felt a pang of fear but decided not to mention it to anyone yet. That night, she tried to sleep but found herself restless. The feeling of being watched intensified. She decided to check the house to reassure herself that everything was fine. As she walked through the darkened rooms, she noticed that every mirror she passed seemed to have an unnatural, dim light reflecting from it. The mirrors were always just slightly out of sync with reality, as if they were showing a parallel version of her home. When she reached her bedroom, she saw her reflection in the large mirror on her closet door. The reflection showed her standing still, but Emma could feel a subtle, chilling breeze coming from behind her. She turned around quickly but saw nothing unusual. When she looked back at the mirror, the reflection was slightly different. It showed her with a pale, fearful expression that she didn't recognize. Emma's anxiety grew. She spent the rest of the night in the living room with the lights on, too frightened to sleep. By morning, she decided to call her parents and ask them to come home early. They returned later that day and found the house in disarray, but everything else appeared normal. Emma never stayed alone in the house again. The mirrors were covered and eventually removed, but the unsettling feeling remained. To this day, she can't explain what she experienced, but she remains convinced that the house harbored something sinister, hiding behind the reflections that distorted reality and perhaps hinted at a darker, unseen presence.